you look at how Matrix is approaching cybersecurity as a partner, they're doing things right for the right reasons, and that's why we get to keep coming back. So we're going to get into the cyber defense matrix. Like Ryan said, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A. We'll go through and we'll address those. And the goal for this is to be as meaningful for you as possible. We're not trying to just have a discussion where we talk about things that we like for ourselves. We want to help you get to that next step. So first, we're going to look at a little bit of a history of the cyber defense matrix, the CDM. You may hear me say those things interchangeably. We'll look a little bit at kind of tomorrow's NIST, because that is different than where we're at today, why it's important. And then we'll look at kind of what coverage is using this tool for both table stakes security, and as you scale up, what does it look like to the point where you get to highly regulated industries like regional banks. And then we'll look at some actual case studies where this is applied. So one personal pet peeve of mine, being in the security industry forever, was that usually when you went to things like this, 10, 15 years ago, it was generally a concept. Here's a concept. And you would never get any applied ways to move forward. And so that's a personal mission of mine, is to make sure that we're giving you actual drivers that you can use as a way forward. So real world case studies. And I just want to highlight a couple of things here, is that in these two cases, or what we're looking at for today, these are not a full deliverable, and these are not vendor recommendations. So we are working to let you know, especially in the case studies, what were the drivers, but we're not saying do this route, because every specific route that we might give is probably specific for someone else and might not be right for you at any given time. So again, this is your time. Ryan said it, I said, I'm going to say it again. Please ask questions. We should have some time at the end to go through and cover some questions as well. And we want this to benefit you. So when we look at the cyber defense matrix itself, and as we look at NIST, as we look at some of the other kind of paradigms in the industry, this is as much an art as it is a science. And so if you have a strong technical background, if you've got a strong engineering background, we say things like, what's the best thing for right now? Well, that's an absolutely valid discussion. But as we step up above the technical solutions and look at outcomes, there's a significant amount of art that gets involved as well. So what might be the right thing right now might actually be encompassed by something bigger, and we'll show that. Now, anytime you look at using some of these tools, there are a best effort, and no one in the industry really agrees on this. So I'm going to talk about some people that are luminaries in the industry, and I'll highlight a little bit about even how we disagree as we sit down at some of the events on what this should look like, and why a lot of this, again, especially at a couple different areas of the market, can be really, really good or needs a little bit of change. So really what this is, and I want to drive this home, as we look at all of these tools, they allow you to tell the best story. And that's the part that we're really seeing in the industry that a lot of people struggle with right now, is how do we take what's generally an incredibly technical, complex set of things that are all across our infrastructure, all across our asset classes, and what's the story we need to tell? And then how do we tell that story in order to get additional investment, say from the board, or additional commitment from other stakeholders, so that way we can really do the things that we need to accomplish for the right goal, for the right reasons.
Stefan, if I can real quick, I do have a question from the audience on where they can access the matrix themselves so they can fill this out as we're going through the presentation. That's my bad. I meant to mention that in the beginning. For everyone that is on this call, you should have received an email about an hour ago with the subject line "Action Required." cyber defense matrix. That gives you an opportunity to download a copy of this and actually fill it out as best to your ability as we go through this presentation. Feel free to email your Matrix Networks representative if you don't have that email, and we can get it over to you as soon as possible. Again, ultimately, though, this is not going to be a situation where you walk away with all the bells and whistles and understanding of how it's going to be applied to your organization. That's our job to help facilitate. Selfish plug. All right, back to you, Stefan.
Thank you. And that's an incredibly valuable thing that you just jumped in with. So, feel free, Ryan, jump in with more of those. Again, this is supposed to drive strong value. Okay. And then I just want to target this last little bullet here of assessments. So in the industry, in the security industry, you're going to hear this word assessment all the time. One of the really tough things about security is that almost every time you hear the word assessment, it's going to mean something different to different people. If you ask 30 people in the room what an assessment is, you will get 40 different answers. So this cyber defense matrix exercise, whether you're doing it yourself or preferably with Avant and Matrix together as a unified front, even that is still not a full assessment. And so there's a lot of due diligence involved when you use those words. And if we hear, oh, we just had an assessment, one thing you'll need to know is we're going to ask a question. What does it mean, and what was that covered, and what were the outcomes? So let's start jumping into this. And we can't really talk about the Cyber Defense Matrix or NIST without talking about Microsoft. Now, when we go look at the history of this, and we'll just do a little bit of history, because we can't know where we're going until we know where we've been. Microsoft published what they called the PDR framework, Protect, Detect, and Respond. And this was in the late aughts, very early teens, that this was kind of coming out and solidifying in the industry. And it was incredibly useful. Protect, Detect, Respond. And this was generally a loose collaboration across the industry of industry professionals and practitioners, generally with Microsoft and their partners and their clients. And it was very useful. It was a very, very good place to start. Protect what you got, protect the people, detect when there's some sort of a deviation, and then respond. But it didn't necessarily go far enough. And as this was kind of coming up early on in our industry, and here, particularly in America, critical infrastructure was being targeted by our adversaries, and Europe kind of had a stronger play in some of their, we'll say, mature assessment formats. And so as Microsoft is building this, they start to drive a little bit stronger to the point where the Office of the White House, and this is not a political discussion, this is a timetable and letting you know who the players were. Executive Order 13636. Do you really need to know that number? Maybe, maybe not. I actually think it's useful if you just read the executive summary. I think it really is useful to kind of go back and look at it, because a lot of this executive order, if you're going to advocate for more resources at your organization, this actually has language that you can use to advocate more strongly. And I think it's useful. So this particular executive order was the one that said, hey, NIST, as an organization, a US organization, you are now in charge of coming up together with a program that says we're going to improve critical infrastructure cybersecurity. You are the owning authority here in the US that's going to drive what it looks like. So let's look at some of the language in here. Repeated cyber intrusions into critical infrastructure demonstrate the need for improved cybersecurity. You can use that internally as well. So if you're going to advocate for more resources and more investment into security, you could put your company name. Repeated cyber intrusions into our company demonstrate the need for improved cybersecurity. This is some language that's standing the test of time. Here's another one. The cyber threat to critical infrastructure continues to grow. It was true February 12th, 2013, and it's still true right now. In fact, 60 Minutes just released, I think it was last week or the week before, just released an interview with the 5 intelligence leads of the Five Eyes nations talking about some of this. It's a very useful interview that can help frame much of why we do what we do. Now, these were voluntary consensus standards. So this is not the US government saying, thou shall do X. This is saying, here's what we think a target is. Use this if you think it's useful and if it applies. And it is a set of better industry best practices. So it expands past protect, detect, respond, and a best effort to match international standards. So now we're starting to grow. So this is the White House saying, NIST, go be the leader here. The National Institute of Science and Technology, NIST, February 12th, 2013. Well, if we flash forward a year, February 12th, 2014, that's a really fast execution. 1 year for a government agency is very fast to publish consensus standards. So this is useful. And now we have what's called, in normal language, human speak, the CSF, the cybersecurity framework. But here's another issue here. It's a small problem, is that it's really challenging if everyone says they use NIST CSF, or many people do, but the NIST CSF actually isn't called CSF. It's called the Framework for Improving Critical Infrastructure Cybersecurity. Now, a big part of my background, I was one of the U.S. Army's first cyber officers. There's a joke that's been made around for years, and that in government, we don't get bonuses, we get acronyms. And so this is absolutely evidenced of that. So the acronym, or what we actually call it, is the CSF. And if you want to know the original documentation, here it is. And this is where you can still see that Microsoft Protect, Detect, Respond framework, PDR. But as you had started to have more people looking at this problem across multiple industries at multiple levels, we started to see that the PDR framework wasn't enough. Because how can you protect something that you don't know exists? If I were to ask many of you on this call today, you had a breach. I'm sorry that you had a breach. Was that breach, did it come through an area that you didn't know existed? A subnet or a VLAN, or through an acquisition that you hadn't heard about yet? You hadn't identified the fact that you had something that you needed to protect. And then here's this last one: respond and recover. These two are very, very important, and they're different. Here's why. The security ecosystem, the silo that does cybersecurity, the organizational group, usually, 10 years ago, thought they had to stop. Once they responded to the incident, they handed it over to IT. They threw it over to the fence and said, great, now go recover. This was really the first time as an industry that we said security and IT overlap, and this is an us problem. It's not you versus me, it's us. And so February 12th, 2014, this started coming out, and you started to see more and more drivers. Well, there's another problem with this, is that in the original version, identify, protect, detect, respond, recover, you had all these categories that would get covered underneath it, then subcategories, then informative resources. And so the vast majority of assessments that we talked about earlier would usually have an executive summary that said, you don't know what you got, please go train your users and build resilient systems. Patch your stuff. But all of the really important information was buried not in the executive summary or the main report. It was usually buried in Appendix B. And the problem was, how do you really show that to people in a way that's meaningful? So we'll get to that in a minute. But if you look at this, identify, protect, detect, respond, recover. Shortly after this came out, you started seeing vendors say, look at us. Look at us. We are a security company because we help you identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. And you talk to him and you're like, actually, you're a managed firewall company. So we can help identify some things, certainly not everything. You're protecting some networks. Detect, you might block, but are you really alerting? Response, well, we can go block something, maybe actively or passively. And then recovery, well, maybe you could make an argument that you could send some information over that firewall to help recover a database. Well, so we knew that this was really challenging to map vendors to this framework, these 5 categories. And back in 2014, a guy named Sunil Yu, a world-class CISO, had this flip the table moment. He's getting upset because every vendor says that they do it all, and we know that they don't do it all. So how do we understand where a vendor fits? So let's look a little bit at Sunil. CISO at Jupiter One, Master's of Science in Electrical Engineering at Virginia Tech. And if you know anything about that program, there's a lot of computer science and EE baked in. Bachelor's of Arts in Econ from Duke. It's a Bachelor of Arts, but at Duke, it's still highly quantitative. Board member of the FAIR Association, which is how we try to manage and understand and quantify risk. CISO in residence at YL Ventures. That's one of the world leading cybersecurity venture capital firms. Former chief security scientist at Bank of America, which, if you know anything about Bank of America, they are constantly hammered by our adversaries, because many of our adversaries think that Bank of America is an American institution, not a private company. That's just a knowledge gap that our adversaries stumble into, and it results that Bank of America gets hit all the time. And that has required them to have extraordinarily good security, and Sunil was a big part of that. 20 patents, influencer of the year. We stopped putting his bio on here because we're just trying to emphasize that he's good. He is world-class. And so Sunil says, if we've got these categories, how do we actually break it out in order to tell a story, in order to communicate? And he goes, well, if we take our categories, identify, protect, detect, respond, recover, and we start overlaying our asset classes, devices, applications, network, data, and users, now in a 5x5 matrix, we can start to say, oh, hello, endpoint detection and response company. You help protect and detect devices. And that company will say, well, we help you respond too. And we go, no, you do, but your primary objective is actually to detect deviations on the device. And so we can start to map based off of what these vendors actually do. We can start to show where they fit and wrap them into our mental model. And that's incredibly, incredibly useful. And Sunil also says, and I agree with him on this, absolutely, that on the identify side, we can use GitHub repositories, and we can use our MAC address table out of a switch or a router. There's a lot of tools that we can use to help identify, technologies that we can use to help identify things. But technology historically has been really tough to use or fully automate on the recovery side. And that's true in both on-prem, data center, hyperscaler cloud, private cloud. This is absolutely true on the recovery side all the time. People are way better after things go wrong. And things go wrong right here. We call this line boom. This is left of boom. This is right of boom. people are extraordinarily good right of boom. And process becomes extraordinarily important the entire way across. Now, I agree with him on this asset. This, absolutely. The industry generally does as well, but the industry is changing. So let's talk about how the industry is changing. Because in 2023, January of this year, NIST said, hey, industry, we think that we need to make a change. Okay, let's talk about that. Ryan, I saw you come off mute.
No, we just had one question about why the matrix that I have is different than yours. You have people and processes down below. I do not.
I will come back to that in just a moment.
Got
it. But wait, there's more.
There's more.
Absolutely. So in 2023, NIST said, there's been enough people asking about this that we think we need to make a change. Okay, what does that change need to be? And enough of the industry has said, we need to add a sixth function called govern. Well, this is tough. This is tough because the govern function is a really good function, but it doesn't necessarily meet the matrix. So in April, the NIST draft 2.0, the CSF, cybersecurity framework, came out and said, we need to add govern. What do you think? And it kind of looks like this. Identify, protect, detect, respond, recover. We've got these 5 elements, and we need to add a govern. Originally, govern had been kind of built into all of these, and it was useful, and that was good. I think I'm on the side, and I've gone back and forth on this. I believe that I am on the side that govern needs to be its own function because it allows us to tell the story better and more simply. But it does break a few things if we really look at this. And I got to tell you, if you feel strongly about this, and I hope you do, I hope you should be on one side of the fence or the other. I agree with this. You have until tomorrow to give NIST feedback. The deadline is tomorrow. So you've got an option to go tell NIST what you think. We're not going to get into all the feedback back and forth of who thinks what on this, but I can tell you that CrowdStrike has said, yes, we agree with it. There's all sorts of luminaries in the space that say they agree with it. There's luminaries in the space that disagree with this. This is the cutting edge. This is the cutting edge, and you've got an opportunity to go give NIST feedback on this due tomorrow. Now, the problem with it is it kind of breaks the matrix a little bit, because if we're going to add govern, well, then that's a whole new column, and it kind of govern is almost exclusively a people function instead of a technology function. Process is still important. Sunil and I have talked about this, and until he makes his own change, because again, he's got the credit here, right? Sunil gets the credit for this. We have decided, at least on our side, to not change it too much from the original intent. But I do think it is useful enough that we need a whole column over here. And that means that this concept of people, process, and technology kind of gets pushed maybe to a second slide. So we've started to kind of really focus on govern, identify, protect, detect, respond, recover. And right now we're using it this way. Now, if you happen to know Sunil and you want to learn more, and I do hope you do, he's got a really good book on it. And I do recommend you go read this book. Who is this book written for? It's written for cyber leaders with a technical background. It's not necessarily written for non-technical executives who might consume this information. And it's not necessarily written for sales leaders. It's not necessarily written for project managers. He is moving that direction a little bit. He's got more. If you want to go deeper, he also talks about how the CIA triad of confidentiality, integrity, and availability also should switch to the DIA triad of distributed, immutable, and ephemeral. Those are a lot of words. You can go learn more in his book. And in fact, if you go to any of his talks, a great way to get the book is just go to one of his talks and you can probably get a signed copy. I've got, I think, 5 to 6 copies of the book from different versions at different points. And he's a friend of mine, so I get to challenge him on this. Anyway, devices, applications, network data, users, govern, identify, protect, detect, respond, recover. If you go into the book, and you start looking at it, you start to see a lot of buzzwords. And many times it's useful to go start mapping this out, to say that source code compromise is a function of detecting applications. And now I will note that Sunil doesn't have the govern column yet, so this is just some of the things that I've put on them. Encryption, tokenization, DLP, DRM, proxy, security awareness training, user lockout, sandboxing, endpoint response, configuration. This is a lot of things. This doesn't necessarily allow us to tell a story, though. And at the end, I've found that using this matrix from a slightly different perspective allows us to tell a story that lets us advocate for additional investment or help tell the story that we need to make a strategic change. And let me show you why that is because if we solve people problems and we start using people functions instead of the tools themselves, still informed by the tools, we can really tell a strong story. And now I'm going to show you a few of these as we get into it. So keep watching, and I've seen some questions come through. Keep asking those questions. So we're going to jump into, again, what is table stakes security versus that next level of being able to get insurance versus that next level of what is industry average versus what does a regional bank need. And then above regional banks at high end of enterprise, this is something that's usually not run by the CISO. It's usually run by a deputy on the architecture side under the project management office. Completely different story. We could have, Ryan, you should have me back on and we can talk about that at some point. You cut out a bit there, bud. I'm going to keep going unless I hear you.
Oh, I said, but wait, there'll be more. And then I said the question that you referenced was actually about whether or not there'll be a recording of this. We will post something down the line a ways, but again, I want to reiterate that this is a framework, and ultimately to gain the real value, we would love to have personalized meetings set up for your organization. So just as a reminder, folks, in the chat, there is a link to mtrx.com/meeting request. Make sure that you're taking advantage of that opportunity. Back to you.
Thank you. Okay, so let's just jump into this a little bit, but I'm not going to show you the cyber defense matrix first. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to talk a little bit about maturity levels on here. And usually what most people are doing in the industry, one of the results of a deep levels assessment says, where are you on a score of 0 to 5 for your NIST alignment? And I'm not going to get into the NIST documentation 853, 171. I'm not going to get into all that sort of stuff. I'm just going to say, where are you on a NIST score from 0 to 5? Now, here's one of those issues that it's in the industry is no one really agrees on what to call these levels. That's fine. They all kind of map to each other. So let's look at them. At table stakes security, we usually call that somewhere between a 0 and 1.9. Carlota Sage, she's a phenomenal fractional CISO. She does great work. She says there really only needs to be 3 levels: grassroots, teamwork, compliance driven, and risk-based. Dan Bloom says there's 5: initial, developing, defined, managed, and optimized. ARC on their ICS says secure, defend, contain, manage, and anticipate. University of Texas, San Antonio, they happen to be one of my favorites, and I'll tell you why. Initial, advanced, self-assessed, integrated, and Vanguard. Why is UT San Antonio one of my favorites? I just like the word Vanguard. I think it's cool. I think it's useful, and it tells a story. Entirety, says vulnerable, aware, reactive, effective, compliant, optimizing, IANS Cloud, which is like, we can go through all of these. The purpose of today is not to compare them all. It's to say there are different, but they all kind of map against each other. So this table stake security is usually right around here. Grassroots. Carlota used to call this ad hoc. Initial, vulnerable, no automation. You can see that 3 different people or 3 different orgs call it initial. So let's map what that looks like, because now we can start building this word picture across our security maturity as well. So the first thing is having some sort of governance, risk, and compliance. And that's some sort of having a maturity assessment or a merger and acquisition assessment if you're going through an M&A. Having a roadmap build and company level policies. So these are company level policies. They're not necessarily like Microsoft 365 level policies of whether you can plug in a USB or not. It's a company level policy that says, can you use USBs? And then those get enforced at technical levels. So this is just general, do we know where we're going as an organization? Next generation firewall. Then we've got managed EDR. If it was just an antivirus, that's usually a protect, signature-based. If it's a behavior-based, it would fall under detect. That's kind of over here. Most EDRs today have EPP, which is antivirus, and an EDR capacity to detect deviations. And if it's a managed, there'll be a somewhat limited response capability. This is on devices, so usually endpoints, sometimes servers. Managed EDR kind of fits right here. It'll be different everywhere. That's why it's so challenging, as Ryan said, is to map this all out strategically. If it's not managed, it usually kind of stops at just protect and detect. This response capability here is one of those nascent ones, by the way, that's like, oh, well, we'll block that endpoint and we'll go reimage it. Boom. Problem's not usually solved at that point. The Band-Aid has been applied, but we haven't solved root cause. Managed patching. That is all about protecting devices. If you've got a big tech stack, that's probably going to sit under, you could have applications that are being patched as well. Really incredibly powerful. Having some sort of a managed SIM. And you can see it doesn't just say SIM, it says managed SIM. That's 24/7 visibility. Having some sort of incident response capacity. And this is an ideal incident response capacity where it's an incident response that can cover all 5 asset classes. Most companies on IR kind of fit in like a couple different categories. Like if they're a software-based incident response, they're probably going to sit right here. If they are an incident response that truly touches all these different areas, great. Then the question becomes, are you ingesting or are you pushing out? And can it tie into the SIM? Like we start to get into all these technical questions that says, where the heck do we actually put this block? Device backups, recovery, virtual machine or database backups. This is the first time that we're usually seeing a data offering here in a meaningful way. Usually most managed SIMs aren't doing data pulls, and most of them incident response capacity is usually, well, the data went out, nothing we can do about it. That's where tying this all together to one story becomes important. Next, multi-factor authentication and single sign-on. That helps you identify users all day long. And oh, by the way, a great phrase for you to use is as you listen to this, identity is the new firewall. And that's identity of not just users, but also devices, applications, code, etc. So this helps us identify users, extraordinarily important. Email security and identity access management, which starts to say who can do what across the entire organization. We start to see awareness training as well, and that's governing users. And then VPN access. And as we go through, remember, this is table stakes. We're going to go higher. we're going to see VPN access go away, because VPN access gives you, usually once you VPN in, you can see pretty much everything. That's not good. Okay, so that was table stakes security, but it ain't good enough to qualify for insurance in most cases. And for most people that are listening to this, you probably don't know your insurance coverage. Your finance department probably doesn't know about it either, but that's where you need to go ask. Usually it's a finance government that says they've got insurance. And if you go look at it, when you go ask them what the actual coverage is, that's usually when people start to get a little uncomfortable, because you go, that's not actually covered. This isn't covered. We're not actually covered to where we thought we were. We either need more insurance or we need to qualify for more insurance. So we've got a couple partners in the industry that give us amazing information that allow us to help you. These are usually the reasons when a company says, hey, insurance partner, we'd like to get insurance. And the underwriters or the brokers or the managed general agencies say, sorry, you don't qualify because you don't have enough stuff. Usually these are the things that aren't enough stuff. So I'm going to walk you through where these things usually fit on the cyber defense matrix. To get to those things, usually you end up getting to kind of like a 2.8, 2.9. Once you've got these things in, you're usually not even at industry average yet. So let's walk through them. Now we've added disaster recovery plan and rehearsals. We've added, we've from patching to managed patching. Now, remember that VPN we said was going to go away. Now we've got a zero trust network access. Now, if you're listening to this, zero trust is an idea. It's not a tool. Zero trust network access is a tool and a service that gets you headed in the right direction of zero trust. So this is where we can say more distinctly, when Ryan Graven logs into Matrix, he only has access to these specific assets at these specific times. So it's more granular than a VPN. We start to see code testing pop up. Do you write good code? Are you getting a penetration test of both your devices and your applications? If you serve a website, do you have some sort of bot management? And there's a million different reasons to do that. I'm not going to get them in today. I'd love to sit down and we could discuss those all day long. Managed next generation firewall, DNS outbound security, DDoS protection on your circuits, privileged access management. Privileged access management is another one of those concepts that has some tools that go into it. So privileged access management is a part of your identity program. It's not your identity program. And this is what says our general user base fall up under identity access, but our super users that's privileged access kind of falls into here. And there's many different ways you can solve these and get to different outcomes. And that's where it becomes like, this is where we see a lot of the art come in, is how you achieve these objectives. Managed SIM we had, impersonation, that gets interesting. If you are an e-commerce company especially, you're probably seeing a drive to like your company being scraped and impersonated, and it becomes a brand risk when you get impersonated on the internet. Like if you sell things online and somebody spoofs and they look like you, you're losing clients, your help desk gets flooded. There's a lot of reasons for this. Not everybody needs it. So I'm going to put it on there. And if you think you do, let us know. Talk to Ryan. We'll get some time scheduled. Phishing tests. Phishing tests help you identify which of your users are high risk. They don't necessarily help you solve the problem. They help you figure out where you need to put your investment to help solve the problem. Network intelligence. This is another tough one. Most managed firewall companies come with some limited threat intelligence, but the quantity of known bad is so much bigger on the internet right now that usually these are 10 to 20 times stronger than these are. And 50% of the breaches that we see are identified with traffic going outbound, not inbound, traffic going outbound. And having additional capacities that layer on top of a firewall are extraordinarily excellent. We say next generation firewall here, next generation protection here. Now that was insurance. Now we're going to jump up to industry average. Industry average is usually in many industries, not in many non-regulated industries, it's usually about a 3. Depending on industry, somewhere between a 2.9 and say a 3.2, 3.3, depending for industry average. So you've seen a lot of this before. Now we start adding staffing and recruiting because it's really tough to find people in this space. Having your attack surface management. And this is just knowing what you got. If you're heavily based into say AWS or Google Platform or now Oracle or Azure, just knowing what you have exposed to the internet is a challenge. Knowing what you have is a non-trivial, incredibly challenging, frustrating problem, because you can't just pull it from IPv4. You can't just pull it from IPv6. You've got to deduplicate all of these things. Your antivirus system, your EDR, is telling you you've got 3,000 endpoints. Your network identification stuff is telling that you've got 6,000. And your patching thing, it says that you have 7,000. Deduplicating all of that to know what you've got is a challenge. Now we've gone from VPN to zero trust network access to service secure edge. Service secure edge is interesting because we've gone from like frame relay networks to MPLS to SD-WAN to now SASE, and security is, or SSE is that security elements, the suite of security products that can get bundled into SASE for connectivity side. This is where you see like many retail sites and work from home users all coming together and doing security meaningfully, many different ways at the network provider and integrating that with managed DDR or XDR. Again, a lot of acronyms that go together, and security works in mysterious ways. Then, of course, we've got switching really from a managed SIM to a SOC, and there is a big difference between these and your MDR platforms. Disaster recovery plan is still there, and we just added phishing tests. It's popped up again. Awareness training, excellent. Now let's look at regional banks. So now we switched from industry average to highly regulated industry with a much stronger requirement and a increased target adversary area. So we're going to say regional banks. We're not going into like big Fortune 100 companies or S&P 500. That's a different story. We'd be glad to work through those with you, and the case studies will highlight this. So industry banks are usually hovering between 4 and 5. They're usually pretty like they've got a foot in both depending on where they're at, and they've induced a lot of art. So let's jump into them. Now we've got a managed governance and risk and compliance side of the house, because most banks don't want to do that themselves. They want to send that out to market. Governance, risk, and compliance, that's usually the ones that are sometimes developing the policies, but they're also looking at how are we adhering to those policies and are we doing it in full coverage. Managed controls assurance. This is an interesting space. This is one that's starting to grow up, because this says if regular employee calls the help desk for help, call desk remotes in to that employee's stuff, they turn off EDR, they turn off a couple things while they're troubleshooting, they get it to work and they leave. Did they actually turn all of the security stuff back on or not? That's a really difficult question to answer. And that's why most like banks are taking that out to market. We're also starting to see micro segmentation pop up. So these are things like, it's a much newer market. So you're looking at things like Threat Locker and Akamai's Guardicore, which is Akamai's Guardicore is doing extraordinarily well in a lot of meaningful ways, along with Threat Locker, and there's some other aspects. This is, again, microsegmentation on the endpoint, which is a part of your zero trust strategy. So again, words mean things, and a lot of times it's just difficult to cut through marketing. OT security, if you have a big SCADA network, we see this as a big element, a big investment, and oftentimes microsegmentation can really drive this strategy as well. Ransomware negotiation, disaster recovery as a service, API discovery. This is actually really challenging in a lot of companies. It's just knowing what APIs you got, then protecting the APIs that you got. You start to see DDoS protection getting tested. That becomes more meaningful. Understanding what data you have and where it is and classifying it so you can get into a data loss prevention model. And then doing some dark web scanning out and to know faster if you've been breached and just don't know it yet. And I think this is interesting. I didn't expect tape to be coming back, but tape backup is coming back. We can get into why. I think it's cool. I did not expect it. And then, of course, because now this is beginning, like Sunil said, there's a lot more technologies on this side of the house. SSPM, CPSM, and code testing. So this is SaaS security posture management and cloud posture security management. These two get confused all of the time. And there's a lot of vendors that don't make it easy anyway to understand which one you're actually getting. They are two different categories. And we've got code testing pop up again more strongly. And then policy enforcement. Policy enforcement is a part of this managed controls assurance, but it's also saying, are our people doing what our policies said? And that's a tough thing to talk about sometimes. Okay, so let's get into some case studies and then we'll open up for questions. So the first one we're going to look at is a manufacturing company. They've got offices and manufacturing on 4 different continents. I have told them that if they do open up in Antarctica, I would like to be a part of that. So I could say that I've been to Antarctica and they become a 5-continent manufacturer. They are the Kleenex of their niche. A couple things for quotes. When we got on with them for the first time, they said something like, we know we've got some big gaps, and a big part of that is because every office has flexibility. That's a tough thing. Think 4 continents. If every office across 4 continents has flexibility, that's a challenge. So as we started to talk with them, it became very apparent that the 2 biggest drivers that they wanted to look at, the first one was maturing their organizational security posture and process and program. And then as we started to peel back the layers, we found that consolidation was actually more meaningful than just maturing. So we'll expose why. When we look at their org chart, they had procurement and acquisitions over here underneath the CFO. They had a chief information officer. They had a board security committee that was just about to get launched. They did not have a CISO. They did not have a project manager. They had 2 engineers and they didn't have an architect. So this is, we're talking really lean system on IT and security. We started mapping it out. Every site, not every continent, every site had the option for a managed EDR or for a different managed EDR. They had 4 different SOCs that they'd subscribed to just in the US. And the program, the engineers that were bestowed the responsibility of being the project manager, they still didn't know what existed out across the other continents. Every site was using a different firewall. They got to be the point where we just stopped documenting in this process which ones, and they've got a initial 2024. They're working on understanding how they can consolidate for 2025 when they've got their finally tech refresh. They've had some asset inventory and patching capacities. They were on Microsoft 365. They had some IAM solutions. They had some cyber insurance. As they went back and looked at it, they realized they just didn't have a lot. M365 backup, and they were using Veeam in some places. The big thing that we did for them, that we're continuing to do for them, is build a plan to get all of these, at least at the continental level, on some of the same vendors, on the same service providers. Because then they can have a continental strategy. And for them, with their operations, it looks like US and Europe are going to get tied together. And some of the other continents are going to kind of be on their own at best fit. And then we've got a 2025 plan for them to do tech refresh. This was another interesting one. This is a private equity backed news media company We got on, they thought it was going to be a quick call. They had about 1,000 users and subcontractors, and they really liked the shared responsibility model for security. So they're relying heavily on AWS, not realizing that AWS does not do their security. It does physical security for the kind of the whole reason to do cloud. They didn't have much after that. They had kind of the ideal org chart: CIO, CISO, architect, 2 engineers, project manager. This is ideal for most mid-market, and we're starting to see these power levels shift a little bit. But they looked just like this, and it was their CISO on the conversation. We started talking through this, and it turns off, they have a pretty good layout. On-prem, they're using Rubrik. They had an IR plan. They were using Optiv for retainer, eCentire and Splunk. eCentire is for on-prem. Splunk, they were duplicating their backups. They had some reasons for that. For cloud, they were using Alert Logic for their MDR. CrowdStrike Falcon Complete, which again, Falcon Complete gets them out into the response category a little bit. Managed patching, informed by Rapid7 and Alert Logic. Akamai for WAF and bot management. FortiGate and Palo Alto for a couple different areas. Akamai for DDoS, FortiClient for their VPN. Microsoft DLP and CASB solutions, because they are Microsoft E3 and E5 plus security. Okta and SailPoint, and then they had Defender for email on the E5 and Abnormal. So when we started looking at these guys, they did have quite a good posture. What they didn't have was any microsegmentation at all. And so they've got a very large microsegmentation process going on right now in their final rounds of budgeting. The last one that we'll hop into real quick, this is a city, municipality, and water service. They were doing some movements. They had some coverage in their water area, though. This is that OT SCADA type thing. A lot of Windows 2008 R2, and they needed additional segmentation. So as we started jumping into this, they didn't have a CISO, wicked sharp person up here that was doing these 2 hats, double-hatted, CIO and CISO. Rubrik clusters, Unit 42 from Palo Alto. CISA was helping them with hygiene. That's a government agency under Department of Homeland Security. Palo Alto Cortex, a lot of Palo Alto. And then they had so much that they needed. And they didn't have budget for it. So what we did was we said, let's go look at applied network intelligence. We took a packet capture from them. We took that packet capture out, and what ended up happening was we found an Iranian threat actor. That's their whole reason to exist, is to hold U.S. infrastructure at risk. There's an Iranian threat actor operating on their network at the time. So we got Department of Homeland Security involved, and Department of Homeland Security is now actively, they're working through this process right now. They're about done with the cleanup. And then this budget cycle is now, because of that incident, unfortunately and fortunately, we caught this before it existed. Now they're able to go and build a stronger security posture. So with that, Ryan, I'm going to hand it back over to you.